You guessed it, I'm making another spear gun. Join me as I make my second gun in a row, completely from scratch, out of wood. This time I'm going to make a 90cm single roller gun. Is it a bit overkill for the UK? Probably. Do I care? Nah. Let's go.
Before I started making the gun, I made a rough design on CAD software. I wanted to make a gun that was a similar size to my current gun but had a lot more range, and a 90cm roller fits this perfectly. Once I'd finished designing, it was then time to start manufacturing, but first I needed to decide what wood I'd use. There are several options available, of which I've put on screen now, and for this particular build I'm going for sapelli. Now that we've selected our wood, we're going to make the blank. Once we've selected our stock, we can't really leave it in this current state because over time it will tend to twist, bow and deform. And we want our brand new gun to be straight and stay that way. To do this, we need to cut the stock into thin strips and glue them together, known as laminating. Alternating the grain direction between strips will ensure that each strip is pushing against the other. This will improve the overall stiffness of the gun and reduce warping. Here's what a laminated blank should look like, and you can clearly see the opposing grain structures on the strips. And now we need to do this to our actual stock. Before cutting the stock into strips, I need to ensure that the entire stock is straight and square. Make sure you mark your end grain up before cutting so that you don't lose track on what your grain direction is. I ended up cutting my strips at about 15mm wide each, and from this stock that gave me 6 lambs. Generally speaking, I'd say you'd need about a minimum of 3 lambs for a spear gun. For this build, I'm going to use an odd number of strips. That way I can use a centre strip to carve the barrel into. Once all the lambs are cut, I then need to ensure that they're all nice and flat for the glue up. Initially I opted for sandpaper for this, but this turned out to be pretty inefficient, so I changed it up for a decent hand plane instead. The flatter the mating surfaces, the less likely you are to have gaps after the glue up. Once I'm happy, I drop the board down to 5 laminations and then alternate the grain direction of the strips. Now it's time for the glue up. As I said before, this particular glue is actually really good for sapelli. It's also the same glue I used for my first gun, which is still going strong at 7 years old. But it definitely wouldn't work with any high oil content wood like teak, for example. Now you want to be quite generous with the amount of glue you apply. It's better to have too much than not enough, because any excess will just be squeezed out when you tighten the clamps up, whereas if there's not enough, you end up with gaps. If you're making a gun out of teak, then you need to use 2-part epoxy resin as your adhesive rather than wood glue, making sure you give the strips a good wipe down with acetone beforehand. To help keep the blank straight while gluing, you can add a straight piece of metal or wood to the blank before clamping tight. I didn't have this, so I relied entirely on the sash clamps. Once everything's all nice and tight, wipe away any excess and then leave for at least 24 hours. Once everything's dry and you've removed the blank from the clamps, you're probably going to have some excess glue that you're going to need to remove, and then once you've done that, you're probably going to need to slightly re-square the blank again to ensure that it's entirely straight. As you can see here, I've got quite a lot of excess glue that I need to remove. I've still ended up with some gaps, but hopefully these should be removed when shaping. If not, I can just simply fill them at a later stage. Once all the excess material is removed and the blank is straight again, we then need to age the blank for a number of weeks. We do this to allow the wood to move before then squaring it up once again and carving the track. With the blank now sat aging, it was time to move on to making the handle. When designing the handle, I didn't have anything specific in mind, just a general shape, and I was pretty much going to wing the whole thing and see what I can come up with on the fly. But I did have this one really nice piece of wood that I wanted to use for it. Much like the speargun blank, I'm going to cut this down into smaller pieces and laminate it. I'm pretty much copying the exact same process I used for the blank, making the strips, alternating the grain, and then gluing them together and clamping. Now that everything's all nicely clamped up, it's going to be left for at least 24 hours to dry. Next, I needed to flatten the top surface, as this is going to be the mating surface that is joined to the blank at a later stage. Once happy, it was then time to start removing material from the stock. Using a basic template cut out from cardboard, I can trace a rough outline of the handle onto the wood before removing large amounts of material and starting the basic shape. To remove this much material, having a bandsaw would be ideal. Unfortunately for me, this wasn't an option, so I had to resort to hand tools and Forstner bits. This method did the job, but it was a lot more time consuming. That's one side done. Now to start the front. Now that I have a rough outline, I can start with the basic shaping. For this, I'm going to use a gouge to start with. Eventually I move on to the finer detailing, and for this I'm using a Dremel. For this I use a combination of sanding drums, carbide burrs and cutting bits. By this point the handle's starting to shape up real nice, but it's not there yet. More sanding and material removal is needed to ensure that the handle fits in the hand comfortably.
Sweaty business this, but worth it. It's looking nice.
For a nice finishing touch, I decided to add some small indentations with the Dremel. Not only for aesthetics, but also to help improve grip. The end result was quite nice, but the sanding discs ended up leaving some burn marks. So I ended up buying some really nice carbide cutters and redoing it, and the end result for this was much better. It took quite a while, but I'm very pleased with the end result of this handle. The wood has some amazing grain patterns, and I can't wait to see what it looks like with a finished coat on. Anyway, that's enough for this one. Be sure to come back for the next video where I'll be carving out the barrel and adding the rollers to the blank. See you next time.